My dad and stepmom came to my house demanding I get out. But when I reminded them of my age, their faces drained of color like they'd seen a ghost. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a nurse. On the outside, I look like I've got everything together: my own little house, a decent career, and a life I built with no one's help. But the truth is, the road here wasn't easy, and the two people who should have protected me the most were the ones who hurt me the deepest: my dad, Richard, and his wife, Claudia. Growing up, it was just me and Dad after Mom passed away. For a while, it felt like we were getting through it together. Then he met Claudia. At first, I wanted to believe she could bring happiness back into his life, but she came into our home with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When I was 13, she moved in with her two kids, Lily and Josh. Suddenly, I didn't belong in my own house anymore. I'll never forget the day Claudia told me I had to give up my bedroom so her daughter could have it. Dad just stood there, avoiding my eyes, and said, "You'll understand one day. This is for the family." From that moment on, I knew where I stood. I was an extra, someone they tolerated because they had to. As the years went on, Claudia chipped away at every bit of space I had. She called me a burden more times than I can count. My dad didn't defend me. He stopped paying for things I needed, saying money was tight, but somehow Claudia's kids always had new clothes and school trips covered. By the time I turned 16, I was working part-time jobs just to buy my own essentials. When I turned 18, the final blow came. Claudia told me flat out that I needed to leave. Dad didn't argue. He said, "You're grown now, Emily. It's time you learned independence." The words stung so badly I felt like my chest caved in. But I packed my bags and left, with nowhere to go except a tiny rented room. I cried myself to sleep many nights, but I kept going. I worked through college on my own, every dollar stretched thin. I studied nursing while pulling night shifts at diners and cleaning offices on weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me alive. Slowly, I built something for myself. By the time I was 27, I had saved enough to buy a modest house. Standing at the front door with the keys in my hand was the first time I felt like maybe I'd finally won. I didn't think much about my dad and Claudia anymore. I heard from neighbors they were struggling financially, but I pushed the thought away. They hadn't been there for me, and I had no reason to go back. That's why, when they showed up at my door one evening, it felt like the past had walked right into my present. Claudia barely greeted me before she started criticizing the house, as if she owned it. Dad avoided eye contact, just like he used to when I was a teenager. I stood there frozen, wondering what they wanted from me now. And then Claudia said the words that made my stomach twist. "We need you to move out. We'll be staying here now." That was the moment I reminded them exactly who I was, and how old I was. The shock on their faces told me they didn't expect the girl they threw out to ever stand her ground. When I think back to the years that shaped me most, my mind always goes to the time right after my mom was gone. I was 13, still a kid who wanted to believe my dad would keep me safe no matter what. Instead, that was the year everything shifted. Dad remarried, and with his new wife Claudia came her two children, Lily and Josh. From the beginning, it felt less like a family being built and more like a takeover. Claudia had a way of making herself the center of every room she walked into. She spoke sweetly to Dad, always praising him, always making him feel important. But behind that charm was something sharper. She made it clear I wasn't her priority, and it didn't take long for her to make sure Dad treated me the same way. It started with little things. I'd notice how Dad would set aside money for Lily's school supplies, but tell me we had to cut back when I needed something. Claudia always seemed to whisper just enough in his ear to turn every situation in her favor. If her kids wanted something, it became urgent. If I asked for anything, I was told to wait or do without. The day I lost my bedroom is burned into my memory. I came home from school, dropped my backpack, and walked down the hall to find my things piled in boxes. Lily was already moving her clothes into my closet. I remember standing frozen in the doorway, not understanding what I was looking at. Claudia smiled at me, like this was some generous favor she was doing. "Lily needs her own space," she said. "You'll be fine in the smaller room." I turned to Dad, waiting for him to tell her no, that I deserved to keep my space. But he didn't. He just sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, "You'll understand one day. This is for the family." Those words cut deeper than anything Claudia had ever said. It wasn't just about the bedroom. It was proof I no longer came first in his world. From then on, it was clear where I stood. Claudia's children had places of comfort, support, and attention, while I had silence and the constant reminder that I was an outsider in my own home. The shift wasn't subtle. It was complete. Meals, conversations, even family outings, everything revolved around Claudia and her kids. I was expected to be grateful just for being allowed to stay under the same roof. It wasn't only the physical space I lost the feeling of belonging, of being wanted. My father's words echoed in my head for years. You'll understand one day. I waited for that day to come, for it all to make sense, but the older I got, the clearer it became. There was no deeper lesson. He had chosen them over me, plain and simple. Those years left scars I couldn't see but always felt. Every time Claudia smiled at me with that practiced sweetness, every time Dad looked away when I needed him, the wound grew. By the time I was old enough to leave, I had already learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the people you love most are the ones who teach you what betrayal really feels like. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening in that house, the message was clear. If I wanted anything of my own, I had to earn it myself. Dad no longer offered money for the simplest needs. If my shoes wore out, I picked up extra shifts after school. If I needed a jacket for winter, it meant saving every dollar I could. While other kids my age spent weekends at football games or hanging out at the mall, I was behind the counter at a diner, wiping tables and pouring coffee just to afford the basics. Claudia never missed a chance to remind me how unwanted I was. She didn't whisper it, she said it outright. You're nothing but a burden, she'd mutter when she thought I wasn't listening, though sometimes she'd say it loud enough for me to hear on purpose. Her kids never heard those words. To them, she was all affection and support, but to me, she was cold, dismissive, and sharp. The final straw came on my 18th birthday. Most kids mark that day with cake, laughter, maybe even a sense of freedom. Mine came with a suitcase. Dad sat me down at the kitchen table, Claudia standing right behind him like a shadow, and told me it was time to learn independence. He said it as though he was doing me some kind of favor, as though forcing me out would somehow make me stronger. But all I heard was rejection. All I felt was the ground disappearing beneath me. I packed my things into bags that barely held together. There was no hug, no promise to check on me, no safety net waiting if I failed. Claudia watched with satisfaction, her arms crossed, while Dad avoided meeting my eyes. They didn't even ask where I would go. That night, as I sat in a rented room with nothing but a few clothes and the money I'd saved from my shifts, I made myself a promise. I would never ask them for help again. It wasn't pride. It was survival. I knew if I reached out, they'd only use it against me, reminding me of the moment they claimed they were teaching me to stand on my own. If I wanted a future, I had to carve it out myself, no matter how hard it was. So that's what I did. I enrolled in nursing school, paid for with scholarships, loans, and every hour of work I could take. Some nights I went without sleep, studying through the exhaustion of back-to-back shifts. I remember sitting in quiet libraries with aching feet, reminding myself over and over that I couldn't give up, not after everything I'd already survived. There were times when the weight of it nearly crushed me. Times when I thought about calling my dad, just to hear his voice, just to feel like I still had someone in the world. But each time, I remembered the way he had looked past me as I carried my bags out the door. That memory was enough to silence the phone in my hand. I carried that vow with me through every challenge. I would build a life without them, prove that I could stand taller than the names Claudia threw at me, stronger than the indifference my father had shown. They had closed their doors on me, but I was determined to open new ones on my own. The years after I left home were some of the hardest, but they were also the ones that shaped who I became. I started out in a cramped studio that barely fit a bed and a table. The walls were thin, the heater rattled in the winter, and sometimes I had to choose between groceries and the electric bill. Still, it was mine. No one could tell me to move my things. No one could shove me aside. That little space gave me the first taste of freedom I'd ever had. My days were long and my nights even longer. I worked shifts at the hospital as soon as I was licensed, and before that I took any job I could get. Waitressing, cleaning, even babysitting on weekends. I lived with a planner in one hand and exhaustion in the other, but each paycheck meant progress. Slowly I saved. Slowly, I built a life that belonged only to me. There were moments I wanted to give up. When I came home after 16 hours on my feet and collapsed on the mattress, I sometimes wondered if it was worth it. But every time I questioned myself, I thought about the suitcase in my father's hallway and the look on Claudia's face when she called me a burden. That memory pushed me forward. By my late 20s, I had done more than I ever thought possible. I signed papers for a modest house, a place with peeling paint and an old fence, but to me it looked like a palace. Holding those keys, I felt something I had never known before, pride without apology. I had built this from nothing, with no safety net, no family to lean on. Each brick, each dollar, each moment of exhaustion had led to this door that opened only with my key. It wasn't just about the roof over my head. It was about proof. Proof that I could survive the storm they left me in. Proof that I didn't need their approval or help to succeed. My independence became my armor, and with every passing day, I grew more certain that I had escaped their shadow for good. But even when you try to move on, pieces of the past have a way of circling back. I'd hear bits of news from old neighbors or acquaintances who still lived in the town where my father stayed. I learned that the choices he had made, especially with money, weren't working out. Investments had gone bad, bills piled up, and the life he had once been so proud to show off was slipping away. Claudia, I was told, wasn't handling it gracefully. She had built her identity on appearances, and now those appearances were crumbling. Hearing about their troubles stirred something complicated inside me. I wasn't happy to know they were struggling, but I wasn't sad either. Mostly, I felt distance, like I was watching strangers from afar. After all, they had turned me into a stranger long before. At the time, I never imagined their problems would cross into my world. I thought my chapter with them was closed. My focus was on building my career, keeping my home, and living the life I had earned. It seemed impossible that the people who once pushed me out would ever walk back through my door. And yet, deep down, I should have known better. Some stories don't end cleanly. Some doors, no matter how tightly you lock them, have a way of being knocked on again. I never thought they'd come knocking at my door, but they did. It was a quiet evening after a long shift at the hospital. I had just poured myself a cup of tea and settled on the couch when a sharp knock rattled the front door. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, maybe someone dropping off mail by mistake. But when I opened it, the last faces I expected to see were standing on my porch, my father and Claudia. The sight of them there, side by side, brought a rush of memories I had spent years trying to bury. They didn't look like visitors who came with warm intentions. Claudia had her arms folded across her chest, scanning the doorway like she was already judging what she saw. Richard stood slightly behind her, shifting uncomfortably, his gaze fixed anywhere but on me. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should even let them in. But before I could say anything, Claudia brushed past me with a tight smile that held no kindness. She stepped into my living room like it was her own, her eyes darting from the curtains to the furniture. "Well," she said, her voice laced with disdain, "this place is cozy, though you really should think about updating. These colors are terribly outdated." Her tone made it clear she wasn't offering advice, but passing judgment. My stomach twisted at the audacity of it. After years of silence, the first words out of her mouth were criticisms of the life I had built. Richard followed more slowly, still avoiding my eyes. He lingered near the doorway, fidgeting with his hands, as if even standing inside my home made him uneasy. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. I didn't respond right away. I watched them both, waiting, my heart pounding harder with each second. They weren't here for small talk. I knew them too well for that. There was a reason they had shown up unannounced, and it wasn't just to comment on my furniture. Claudia walked through the space with the air of someone inspecting property she might purchase. She ran her fingers along the shelf, glanced at the pictures on the wall, and gave a little laugh as though amused by how I lived. Every gesture, every look, carried the same entitled edge she had always worn when I was younger. It felt like she had stepped right back into the role of authority she used to hold over me. But this time, the walls surrounding us weren't hers, they were mine. I leaned against the arm of the couch, crossing my arms as I tried to mask the unease curling in my stomach. "Why are you here?" I asked finally, my voice steady though my chest was tight. Richard shifted again, glancing at Claudia as if waiting for her cue. She didn't answer right away, just gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We thought we'd drop by," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "It's been a long time." Her words were empty, a flimsy cover for something else. I could feel it pressing in around us, unspoken but heavy, filling the room like a storm waiting to break. Richard's silence, Claudia's smug expression, the way they had arrived without warning, it all pointed to something more. Suspense clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I didn't know what they were about to say, but every instinct in me screamed that whatever their reason was, it would not be simple, and it would not be good. The silence stretched until Claudia finally broke it, her smile tightening into something sharper. She glanced at Richard, then turned back to me as though this were her stage. "We'll get straight to the point," she said. Her voice carried that same clipped authority I remembered from years ago, the kind that never allowed space for anyone else to speak. She folded her hands together and delivered the words without hesitation. "We've had some financial setbacks. The bank is taking the house. We can't stay there anymore." The air left the room. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her, but the stiff way Richard shifted on his feet confirmed. My father wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't even lift his head. Before I could process it, Claudia went on, her tone hardening. "So, you'll need to make room here. We'll move in with you for a while. It's time for you to step up and be a good daughter." The demand hit me like a slap. I stared at her, stunned, my mind spinning back to the night I carried my bags out of their house with no place to go. The cold air outside, the weight of rejection, the words ringing in my ears about how it was time for me to learn independence. Every memory I had tried to lock away crashed over me all at once. Claudia didn't stop there. She tilted her chin, looking around my living room as though she already owned it. You wouldn't even have this place if it weren't for us. All that responsibility you learned? That was because we pushed you out. You should be grateful. Her words twisted in my chest, equal parts insult and mockery. Gratitude? For being abandoned? For being told to survive on my own? My hands tightened against my sides, nails pressing into my palms. I could feel anger rising hot and sharp, but I refused to let it spill. I kept my expression steady, even though every part of me wanted to scream. The sheer entitlement, the way she framed their cruelty as some kind of gift, it was almost surreal. Richard remained silent, letting her speak for both of them, his head bowed like a man too weak to face the truth. Inside, my pulse hammered. The room around me blurred, my thoughts consumed by the echo of my past. At 18, they had called it teaching me independence. Now, years later, they expected to reap the rewards of the very pain they caused. I forced myself to take a slow breath, steadying my voice. If I gave in to the anger burning inside, I knew she would twist that too. Calm was the only weapon I had in that moment, and I intended to use it. I looked straight at Claudia, then at my father, and finally said what had been sitting on my tongue since the moment they walked through the door. No, you're not moving in here. I built this life myself, without help from either of you. Everything in this house came from my own work. The refusal seemed to stun them for a second, but Claudia recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing. Unbelievable, she snapped. After all we did for you, this is how you repay us? You're selfish, Emily. Completely ungrateful. Her words struck with the same venom I remembered from when I was younger, but this time they didn't sink into me the way they used to. They bounced off hollow because I knew the truth. I didn't know her anything. For the first time that evening, Richard finally raised his head. His voice was quieter than Claudia's, but carried the weight of disappointment he knew would hurt. We're family, he said, each word deliberate. You owe us at least this much. That sentence hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. I stared at him, trying to recognize the man I once trusted, but all I saw was someone who had abandoned me long ago. His appeal to blood ties rang false because I had lived the reality of what family meant to them. My chest tightened as a memory cut through me with brutal clarity. The night of my 18th birthday, standing in the kitchen with a suitcase at my feet, hearing him tell me I was on my own. Back then, those words crushed me. Now, standing in my own home, I realized they freed me. He had set me apart, and I had survived. The room shifted in that instant. The weight I had carried for years, the power they once held over me, dissolved. Claudia was still talking, still accusing me of being heartless, but her voice sounded distant, almost desperate. Richard's attempt to guilt me no longer landed. For the first time, I wasn't the frightened girl trying to hold on to scraps of their approval. I was the one in control. They had no claim here, no authority. My refusal wasn't just about keeping my home. It was about reclaiming every piece of myself they had tried to take away. The balance had turned, and we all knew it. I didn't flinch when Claudia's voice rose, or when my father tried to level me with that tired look of disappointment. Instead, I took a steady breath and spoke clearly, each word sharp with memory. Do you remember what you told me the night you shoved me out? You said I was grown, that I didn't need you anymore. You told me to figure it out on my own. The color drained from Claudia's face at the exact words she had once delivered like a sentence. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. For once, she had no clever remark, no cutting insult to hurl back at me. She looked like someone caught in a trap she had built for herself. I turned my eyes to Richard, waiting for him to deny it, to claim I was twisting the past. But he didn't. His shoulders slumped, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Silence was all he gave me, and in that silence was admission. He remembered. He knew. I stepped closer, not with anger but with certainty, my voice steady. That was 10 years ago. I'm 28 now. I don't need your approval. I don't need your roof. I don't need your rules. You don't get to walk back into my life and act like you're in charge of me. The words hung between us, final and unshakable. Claudia shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the door as if she was already calculating a retreat. Richard stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze, the weight of his own hypocrisy pressing down on him. For years they had carried themselves with authority, certain I would always bend under their control. But now, in my living room, with no power left to claim, they were the ones cornered. They had no defense against their own cruelty, no way to rewrite the history I carried in perfect detail. I could see the shock in their faces, the realization that the girl they had once dismissed had grown into a woman they could no longer command. In that moment, the balance was no longer just shifted, it was shattered, leaving them exposed and me unshaken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Calm and deliberate, I pointed toward the door. You're leaving. Now. Claudia snapped out of her stunned silence, her eyes flashing with anger. You can't be serious, she barked, her words sharp and incredulous. "We're not going anywhere. This is family business." Her defiance didn't rattle me. I reached for my phone, holding it where she could see. "Either you walk out, or I call the police. Your choice." My tone was steady, without hesitation. That threat landed harder than any argument. Claudia froze, her mouth opening and closing, fury written across her face. She muttered under her breath, but she stepped back toward the hallway. Richard raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice softer, almost pleading. "Emily, come on. Don't do this. We just need some time, a place to stay until we figure things out. Please, it doesn't have to be this way." His attempt to sound gentle might have swayed me years ago, when I still craved some sign that he cared. But that need had burned out long ago. "It already is this way," I told him firmly. "You made sure of that." They hesitated, but I didn't. I opened the door wide and waited. The message was clear. Either they left on their own, or they would be removed. Claudia stormed past me first, muttering curses under her breath, her voice muffled as she stepped into the night. Richard lingered a second longer, his shoulders heavy, before following her out. I shut the door and turned the lock with a final, solid click. For a moment I stood there, leaning against the wood, listening to the faint sound of Claudia's angry words fading into the distance. Then silence. It was the first silence that didn't feel empty. It felt clean, like a burden finally lifted from my chest. For years, I had carried the weight of their rejection, their voices echoing in the back of my mind. Tonight, that weight was gone. They no longer held any power here. For the first time, the house felt entirely mine, not just in name or on paper, but in spirit. I had reclaimed more than just a space. I had reclaimed myself. When the door clicked shut and the sound of their footsteps faded, I stood in the stillness of my living room, letting the moment settle. What had just happened wasn't about payback for old wounds. It was something deeper. It was balance being restored. For years, they had written the rules, pushed me aside, and told me I wasn't enough. Tonight, I rewrote the ending. I sank onto the couch, my body heavy from the rush of adrenaline. My eyes drifted to the walls, the shelves, the simple pieces of furniture I had chosen myself. None of it was extravagant, but each item told a story of effort, of nights I stayed awake pushing through exhaustion, of days I held myself together when giving up seemed easier. This home was more than wood and plaster. It was living proof that I had survived without them. In the quiet, my mind wandered back to that night at 18. I could still see the peeling wallpaper of my old bedroom, the worn-out suitcase, the way my hands shook as I zipped it shut. I remembered the hollow sound of the door closing behind me as I stepped out into a world that didn't feel like it had room for me. I remembered the loneliness that followed, the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made a mistake by believing I could carry myself through. And yet, I had carried myself. I had taken those nights of fear and turned them into years of progress. I had turned their rejection into resolve, their cruelty into drive. Every choice I made brought me further from the girl they had tried to break and closer to the woman who had just stood in her own living room and told them no. It struck me then that what I felt wasn't spite, it was freedom. I didn't need their approval, their excuses, or even their apologies. What I needed was already mine, my independence, my strength, my peace. That was justice enough. I let out a long breath, the kind that comes when a weight you didn't realize you were carrying finally falls away. The house seemed quieter, lighter, as though it too had been waiting for me to draw that line. A final thought passed through my mind as I leaned back and let the silence hold me. They had stripped me of so much when I was just a teenager: security, belonging, even the illusion of family. But this time it was different. This time, I was the one who decided how the story ended. They took everything from me once. This time, I took back everything they thought they still controlled. And with that, I finally felt whole. Do you think I made the right choice by turning them away? Or should I have given them another chance? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories.